minor tremor went unnoticed by the executives in the Aethelred Tower, but in the sub-basement, Elias caught a scent that wasn't on any sensor's report. Working an extra shift for his asthmatic daughter, the janitor recognized the familiar, dangerous signature of the developer's cost-cutting past. He brought his warning to the chief engineer, a man who proudly called human observation obsolete in the face of his infallible AI. "The system sees all," the engineer said, dismissing him with a wave. But Elias knew the most dangerous flaws are the ones you can't see on a screen, only smell in the air.
This is TS Simple Serene Stories. Before we get back to this touching story, I have a quick question for you. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe that humanity and miracles are eternal, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get back to the story.
The first sound of the morning wasn't the distant city traffic or the birds on the fire escape, but the quiet, rhythmic hiss of the nebulizer. For Elias, it was the sound of life itself. In the pre-dawn glow of their small apartment, he moved with the quiet precision of a man who had long ago memorized every step of a critical procedure. His hands, calloused from mops and wrenches, were surprisingly gentle as he checked the filter on Maya's machine, his movements as practiced as if he were servicing a delicate piece of industrial equipment. He had been a systems technician once, before the layoffs, and the muscle memory remained.
"Papa, is it Saturday?"
Maya's voice was small from her bedroom, still thick with sleep. "It is, my love," he called back, pouring the correct dose of medication into the chamber. "But I have to work today, just for a little while." He walked into her room and saw her sitting up, her 8-year-old frame looking frail against the oversized pillows. Her breathing was even, for now. On the wall, a calendar from the local pharmacy had a date circled in red. Dr. Tran, new nebulizer. The exclamation point was Maya's. The cost, a heavy weight in Elias's mind, was his alone. It was the sole reason he'd taken this rare Saturday day shift, trading his ghost-like nights for the chaos of the tower at full occupancy.
"For my new machine?"
she asked, her eyes bright with understanding. "For your new machine," he confirmed, kissing her forehead, "so you can breathe as easy as a bird in the sky." An hour later, on the bus heading downtown, the Aethelred Tower dominated the skyline, a shard of glass and steel stabbing at the clouds. Elias watched it grow closer, a familiar knot tightening in his stomach. He had helped build towers like this, not with his hands, but in sterile meeting rooms, back when he wore a pressed shirt and carried a laptop. He'd worked for Omnicorp, the same developer, and he remembered their playbook. He knew their language, where value engineering was a euphemism for finding the cheapest way, and streamlined installation meant skipping steps no inspector would ever see. He knew that for every gleaming facade Omnicorp erected, there was a hidden world of compromised materials and predictable shortcuts in its bones. He clocked in through a service entrance in the sub-basement, the air already cooler and heavier than outside. As he pushed his cart of supplies toward the janitorial closet, he saw his supervisor, Henderson, pacing frantically by the service elevators. Henderson was a man perpetually stressed, his tie always slightly askew, his focus a million miles away. He had his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, tense murmur. "I don't care, just move the appointment," Henderson hissed into the receiver. "The therapy schedule is the one thing that can't change. No, I can't leave now." He spotted Elias, and his face hardened into a mask of managerial impatience. He gave a curt, dismissive nod, a gesture that clearly said, "You are the least of my problems," before turning his back and stabbing at the elevator button. The doors slid open, and he disappeared into the steel box, his private crisis ascending into the heart of the tower. Elias watched him go. To Henderson, he was just the janitor, another part of the building's unseen machinery. He didn't know that Elias saw the patterns, and he was beginning to see a very familiar and very dangerous one in the Ethelred Tower. It started as a barely perceptible shudder, a low thrum that vibrated up from the concrete floor and into the handle of Elias's mop. On the polished marble of the grand lobby 40 floors above, it would have been lost in the shuffle of expensive shoes and rolling briefcases. But down here, in the quiet guts of the building, it felt like a disturbed heartbeat. For a moment, the tower seemed to hold its breath. Then, nothing. But Elias had felt it. It was the kind of tremor that his old colleagues at Omnicorp would have dismissed as settling. But he knew better. It was a jolt, sharp and unnatural. He abandoned his cart and walked towards the western wall of the sub-basement, a massive expanse of poured concrete that marked the boundary between the new tower and the ghost of whatever had stood here before. He ran his hand along its cool, smooth surface, his instincts, honed by years of diagnosing building stress, on high alert. That's when he caught it. A faint, sickly sweet scent, like burnt sugar and chemicals. It was almost imperceptible, but for a man who spent his days monitoring the subtle changes in his daughter's breathing, it was as loud as a siren. He followed the smell to a sealed maintenance panel, its edges welded shut. A classic Omnicorp move.
He found Arthur Sterling, the tower's chief engineer, in the glass-walled command center on the 35th floor. Sterling was a man who looked like he'd been designed by the same architects as the building, all sharp angles, polished surfaces, and an air of untouchable superiority. He was rehearsing a presentation, a series of gleaming charts projected on a screen behind him. Firmly, "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling," Elias began, his voice quiet but firm. Sterling turned, his eyes taking a moment to register the man in the gray janitorial uniform. Annoyed. "What is it?" he asked, his tone dripping with impatience. Concerned. "I was in the sub-basement. There was a tremor a few minutes ago, and I think it may have disturbed something near the Western Foundation. There's a smell." Sterling cut him off with a condescending laugh. Condescendingly, laughing. "A smell! You came all the way up here to report a smell?" He gestured for Elias to come closer. A king summoning a peasant. "Let me show you something." He led Elias to the main monitoring console, a dazzling array of screens displaying the vital signs of the Ethelred Tower. Green lines pulsed rhythmically, data streamed in neat columns, and a 3D model of the building rotated slowly, every one of its thousands of sensors accounted for. Boasting. "This," Sterling said, sweeping his arm across the display, "is the most advanced automated monitoring system on the planet. It has 1,000 digital eyes, ears, and noses. It can detect a particle of dust in an air duct on the 70th floor. It is, for all intents and purposes, infallible." As he spoke, his phone, lying on the console, buzzed with an incoming notification. Sterling glanced at it. The screen read, "Alert. Minor air composition variance detected, sub-level 3. He swiped the notification away without a second thought. Arrogantly, "Human observation is obsolete, Eli," Sterling continued, misremembering his name. "Your nose, my nose, they're flawed, organic instruments. They make mistakes." He pointed to a screen. "The system says the air is perfect. Who you gonna believe, me or your lying nose?" He clapped Elias on the shoulder, a gesture not of camaraderie, but of dismissal. Smugly. "Thank you for your concern. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a board meeting to attend where I'll be accepting an award for this building's flawless safety record." Elias stood there for a moment,
the engineer's arrogant words hanging in the sterile air. He could still faintly smell the chemical sweetness in his memory, a ghost that Sterling's perfect billion-dollar system couldn't see. He gave a single, slow nod and turned to leave, the silence of the command center feeling more dangerous than any tremor. Dismissed and invisible once more, Elias retreated from the sterile heights of the command center, the scent of Sterling's arrogance more cloying than the chemical odor he'd tried to report. He ended up back in the sub-basement, drawn by a sense of duty that Sterling's hubris couldn't erase. He stood before the sealed maintenance panel on the western wall, a slab of steel hiding a secret, his frustration a cold, hard knot in his gut. He wasn't alone. A young woman in a sharp business dress stood a few yards away, pretending to be engrossed in a text message. But her phone was angled just slightly, its camera lens aimed not at her face, but at the discolored floor tiles near the sealed wall. She was trying to be casual, but she was as out of place in this concrete service corridor as a songbird in a coal mine. Elias recognized her from the upper floors. Chloe, a junior marketing assistant, he thought. She noticed him watching and quickly pocketed her phone, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just grabbing a moment of peace," she said, her voice a little too bright. "It's chaos up there." Elias simply nodded, leaning his mop against the wall. "It's always quiet down here." Chloe took a step closer, her gaze drifting back to the sealed panel. "This is part of the new construction, right? I'm working on a piece about the tower's history. Do you know if Omnicore used their usual demolition crew for the old site? B&G demolition?" The question was jarringly specific. A marketing assistant wouldn't know the names of demolition contractors. Elias's caution flared. This was not a search for peace. It was a search for information. "I wouldn't know," he answered, his voice neutral. "I just cleaned the floors." "Right, of course," Chloe said, but she didn't leave. "It's just, the records on the site clearance are a mess. Huge payments to B&G, but the disposal manifests are incomplete. Almost like they were paid a premium to make a problem disappear quickly." Her words hung in the air, connecting invisible dots for Elias. He looked from her inquisitive face to the steel plate. The problem hadn't disappeared. It was right there, behind the wall. He decided to offer a piece of his own. "The building that was here before was from the 80s, he said quietly, as if talking to himself. "Different time, different rules. What was considered safe disposal then is a toxic liability now." He tapped a finger against the wall. "Knowing. It's always cheaper to seal a problem up than to dig it out." Chloe's professional mask slipped. For a single moment, he saw the sharp, focused intensity of an investigator. She saw the link. Her trail of corrupt, suspicious payments had led her to this exact spot, to a physical problem a quiet janitor could smell in the air. The financial shortcuts had a physical cost. Probing. "So if something were to happen," she probed, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "something that shook this place up, that sealed problem could become..." hesitant, "unsealed?" "Indifferent." "I wouldn't know," Elias repeated, picking up his mop. Dismissive. "Like I said, I just cleaned the floors." He turned and pushed his cart away, leaving her standing alone in the corridor. He didn't look back, but he could feel her eyes on him. He hadn't found an ally, not yet. But he had found something just as important: confirmation. He wasn't the only one who knew the gleaming Ethelred Tower was built on a foundation of dangerous secrets. And now they were both just waiting for the shaking to start. The main earthquake didn't arrive with a shudder. It arrived with a roar. It was a deep, guttural sound that tore up from the bedrock, a noise so primal it bypassed the ears and was felt directly in the bones. Elias was in the sub-basement when the floor lurched violently to the side, throwing him against a concrete pillar. The world became a symphony of destruction, the tortured groan of twisting steel, the high-pitched shriek of stressed glass from 40 floors above, and the explosive crack of the foundation as the earth heaved beneath them. The lights flickered once, twice, then died, plunging him into absolute blackness. For a terrifying handful of seconds, the Ethelred Tower was a ship in a hurricane, swaying with a sickening momentum that seemed impossible for a structure of its size. Then, as the violent shaking subsided into a series of nervous tremors, a new sound emerged. The building's emergency systems, running on a final gasp of backup power, crackled to life. A calm, automated female voice, the voice of Sterling's infallible AI, echoed through the darkness of every corridor, from the lobby to the penthouse. Warning, a brief pause filled with the sound of panicked, confused shouts from distant hallways. Toxic agent detected. Another pause. Hope and terror warred in the sudden silence. Detected. Was help on the way? Evac! The voice cut out. The speakers hissed into silence as the last of the backup power to the main broadcast system failed. The building was left with only the sound of its own groaning and the rising tide of human fear. Then came the final sound. A series of heavy, percussive thuds echoed from every side of the tower as massive steel shutters slammed down over every window. Deep in the service corridors and at every exit, the definitive metallic clang of heavy blast doors sealed the tower from the outside world. The Ethel Secure Protocol was engaged. The building was now an airtight tomb, but it was not a safe one. Deep within the tower's electronic brain, Sterling's greatest innovation, his fatal flaw, was kicking in. The award-winning disaster resilience mode was not a bug. It was a feature, born of his arrogant belief that he could design a solution for any catastrophe. To prevent suffocation in a sealed environment, the system was designed to bypass normal sensor protocols during a lockdown and use its dedicated power reserves to keep the air circulating at all costs. It worked exactly as designed. The massive ventilation fans, now isolated from the fried sensors that would have screamed at them to shut down, began to spin. The system that was meant to be a lung became a heart, pumping the invisible poison that bled from the ruptured foundation into every sealed office, every hallway, and every corner of the gleaming, perfect, inescapable trap. The world of the Ethelred Tower had split in two. There was the one people knew, of polished marble, panoramic views, and silent elevators. And then there was this one. Elias moved through the building's true reality, a dark labyrinth of dusty service corridors and bundled pipes that snaked through the walls like hardened arteries. The air was thick with the smell of concrete dust and ozone, but it was blessedly free of the sickly sweet taint that was seeping through the upper levels. His flock was small, a handful of terrified survivors he'd guided out of a smoke-filled stairwell. Among them were Chloe, her sharp business dress now smudged with grime, her journalistic instincts replaced by a primal focus on survival, and Henderson, who followed Elias with the wide, humbled eyes of a man whose entire worldview had been shattered. Elias's competence was their only beacon. He didn't consult a map. He read the building itself, pointing out a live conduit sparking in the darkness or using a simple wrench from his cart to crank open a jammed access hatch that had defeated 3 panicked executives.
He knew where Omnicorp would have run the primary water lines.
So he knew which corridors would be safest from electrical hazards. They emerged from a narrow passage into a larger, brighter maintenance junction, a concrete nexus where several corridors converged. And there, under the stark emergency lighting, was Sterling. He wasn't alone. His 3 junior engineers were with him, their faces pale, their company-issued tablets now useless slabs of glass and plastic. Sterling himself was frantic, his carefully composed authority stripped away, leaving behind a raw, desperate man. He was jabbing a finger at a dead control panel on the wall, as if he could intimidate it back to life. He saw Elias's group, and his eyes lit up with an opportunity to reclaim control. "There you are. We have to get to the primary override system. The schematics show it's down this way." He pointed down a wide, well-lit maintenance corridor, its floor clean and its walls neatly painted. It looked official, Safe. It was the obvious choice. Elias looked down the path Sterling indicated, then back at the dark, narrow service tunnel they had just left.
No,
He said, his voice quiet but carrying in the tense silence. Sterling's head snapped towards him. What do you mean, no? I have the schematics. It's the designated emergency access route. You have the schematics for the building they wanted you to see, Elias countered, his gaze unwavering. I know the one they actually built. That corridor runs parallel to the Western Foundation. It runs right over the rupture site. A tense silence fell over the junction. It was the word of a janitor against the building's chief engineer. The three engineers looked from Sterling to Elias, their loyalty wavering. Sterling's face flushed with anger. He couldn't lose control, not now. That's ridiculous. We're wasting time. He turned to his team, his voice booming with forced confidence. You three, go now. Find the manual override panel and report back. I'll stay here and coordinate with other groups, manage the situation from this central point. It was a flimsy excuse, a lie to save face, but it was an order. The three young engineers, caught between their boss's command and the janitor's quiet certainty, hesitated for a split second before their training kicked in. They nodded and hurried down the wide, bright corridor, their footsteps echoing with a confidence they didn't feel. We're going this way, Elias said softly to his own small group, pointing back into the darkness. Henderson and Chloe didn't question him. They had already chosen their path.
As they plunged back into the cramped, unlit service tunnel, the sound of the engineers' footsteps faded behind them. For a few minutes, the only sound was their own breathing and the scraping of their shoes on the dusty floor. Then, from the direction of the other tunnel came a single, sharp scream, abruptly cut short. It was followed by a silence more terrifying than any noise. Later, as they navigated a maze of humming transformers, a figure stumbled out of the darkness ahead. It was Sterling, alone. His face was ashen. What happened? Chloe asked, her voice trembling. Sterling wouldn't meet their eyes. He stared at a point on the far wall, his jaw tight. It's gone, he said, his voice hollow. Defeated. The whole corridor. A structural collapse. The way is blocked. He looked at them then, his eyes pleading for them to believe the lie, to not ask the questions that would unravel him completely. No one spoke. They just followed Elias deeper into the darkness, the weight of Sterling's terrible, unspoken secret, now a part of their shared burden. The journey downward was a descent into the tower's subconscious. They moved through spaces that were never meant to be seen, a world of raw concrete, insulated pipes sweating with condensation, and the constant, low hum of the building's surviving power systems. The only light came from Elias's heavy-duty flashlight and the weaker beams of a few phones, casting long, dancing shadows that turned bundles of cable into lurking creatures. The air was stale, but it was clean, and for that, they were grateful. They had been walking for what felt like hours when Elias held up a hand, bringing the ragged procession to a halt in a small, dry space where several large ventilation shafts converged. We rest here for 5 minutes, he announced. Drink a little water if you have it, not too much. The group slumped against the walls, the brief respite a small mercy in the suffocating darkness. Sterling sat apart, a hollowed-out man lost in his own private hell. Chloe was checking on a woman who had twisted her ankle. Elias stood guard at the entrance to the junction, his flashlight beam cutting a steady path into the darkness ahead, his mind already mapping the next steps. It was Henderson who broke the silence. He limped over to Elias, his face etched with exhaustion and a shame that seemed heavier than any physical fatigue. Elias, he began, his voice raspy. Back there, when you tried to warn Sterling, I just, ashamed, stood there. Elias didn't turn from his vigil. There was nothing you could have done. That's not true, Henderson insisted,
his voice cracking. "I could have listened earlier when you came to me. I heard you, but I didn't listen. I just saw another problem in a day full of them." He leaned his head back against the cold concrete, the sound of his own ragged breathing filling the space between them. "Those calls I'm always taking," Henderson said, his voice dropping so only Elias could hear. "The appointments. It's for my son. He's autistic. The therapy schedules, the specialists, the school. It's a whole other job on top of the one I have here. It's strained, all-consuming. I'm so wrapped up in my own fear for him, my own fight." He finally looked at Elias, his eyes glistening in the reflected light of the flashlight. "Regretful. Today you were working an extra shift. For your daughter's new nebulizer, you said. You were fighting for your kid right in front of me. And I was so blind, so buried in my own panic that I couldn't even see it. I couldn't see another father doing the exact same thing." Elias finally turned to look at him. He saw no supervisor, no box-ticking manager. He just saw a man, terrified and exhausted, stripped down to the same raw core as himself. A father desperate to protect his child. He didn't offer words of comfort or absolution. He just gave a slow, deliberate nod of understanding. It was an acknowledgement, a shared moment of truth in the deep, dark heart of the tower. The chasm between the janitor and the manager vanished, replaced by the simple, profound connection of two fathers. "5 minutes are up," Elias said, his voice even, turning his beam back down the corridor. "We need to keep moving." Henderson straightened up, wiping a hand across his face. The confession was over, but as he fell into line behind Elias, the way he walked was different. The weight of his guilt had been shared, and in its place was a new, quiet resolve. The path Elias chose grew narrower, forcing them into single file. He was leading them through a section of old ductwork, the metal groaning under their weight. It was a shortcut he remembered from an Omnicorp blueprint he'd seen years ago, a cost-saving measure that linked 2 sublevels but was never included in the final building plans. It was a ghost passage, and it led them directly back towards the main service corridor. They emerged onto a graded catwalk overlooking the wide, well-lit tunnel that Sterling had sent his engineers down. But it was no longer bright. A strange, shimmering haze hung in the air, catching the emergency lights and making them blur. The sickly sweet chemical smell, which had been a faint ghost until now, rose up from the corridor below with an overpowering intensity that made their eyes water and their lungs burn. Elias shone his flashlight beam down. There was no rubble. No collapsed ceiling or cracked walls, there was only stillness. The 3 engineers were sprawled on the clean floor, their bodies arranged not in the violent chaos of an accident, but with a placid, horrifying stillness, as if they had simply become too tired to walk and had lain down for a nap. Their tablets lay scattered around them, their dark screens reflecting the hazy lights above. "Ugh!" A collective gasp went through the group. All eyes, one by one, turned to Sterling. It was Chloe who spoke, her voice devoid of its earlier fear, replaced now by a cold, sharp fury that cut through the silence. "You said it was a collapse." It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. Sterling stared down at the men he had sent to their deaths, the last vestiges of his authority, of his pride, of his carefully constructed lies, evaporated into the poisoned air. His shoulders slumped, and a sound, a dry, ragged sob escaped his lips. "I didn't know," he whispered, a pathetic denial that convinced no one, not even himself. I thought the system would hold. It was supposed to be perfect." He looked up at them, his face a mask of utter ruin. "I sent them." The confession hung there, a final damning epitaph for his hubris. No one had the energy for anger or recrimination. There was only the grim reality of what had happened and the urgent need to escape the same fate. Elias turned them away from the scene, his expression unreadable. "This way," he said, his voice pulling them back from the brink. He led them down a final set of stairs, the air growing blessedly cleaner, the chemical scent fading behind them. Their path ended abruptly at a wall of rusted circular steel. A massive floodgate, at least 10 feet in diameter, sealed into the concrete. On its surface was a large wheel, like one from a submarine hatch, and a series of heavy locking levers. It was the storm drain outflow, the tower's final, non-electronic exit to the city outside. It was their door to freedom.
Elias nodded. Firmly. "Henderson, you take the lever, I'll take the wheel. On my count." He positioned them, a small team forged in the darkness. Henderson gripped the cold steel lever, his knuckles white. The security guard braced the pipe against his shoulder. Elias put both hands on the massive wheel, commanding 1, 2, 3. Straining, they heaved in unison. The air was filled with a collective, guttural grunt of effort. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The metal of the gate seemed to absorb their struggle, mocking them with its stillness. Shouting, "Again!" Elias roared. Effortful, they pushed again, a symphony of straining muscles and gritted teeth. A deep, groaning shriek echoed through the chamber as the gate's warped frame protested. The wheel lurched, moving a single, precious inch. "Urgent! Now!" Elias shouted, seeing their chance, commanding, "All at once!" They gave one final, desperate, synchronized shove. There was a sound like a gunshot as a piece of the damaged locking mechanism, unable to withstand the immense, focused pressure, sheared off its bolts. The metal shard whipped through the air, striking Henderson in the leg. "Yelp!" he cried out, stumbling back against the wall, but he didn't let go of the lever, and the gate moved. The seal was broken. With the initial resistance gone, they worked together, the survivors taking turns to help crank the now movable wheel. Slowly, painfully, a narrow gap of profound blackness opened up, a sliver of night that promised fresh air and freedom. They had forced their way out. Henderson was leaning against the wall, clutching his bleeding leg, but he was alive. His redemption had been earned not through a noble death, but through the grit and pain of shared action. His mistake redeemed not by giving up his life, but by fighting to save it alongside everyone else. The first breath of outside air was a shock to the system. It was cold, damp, and tasted of dust and distant smoke, but it was the most glorious thing any of them had ever experienced. One by one, they squeezed through the narrow opening Elias's team had forced, emerging from the blackness of the storm drain into the chaotic, pre-dawn twilight of a city torn apart. They found themselves in a service alley behind the tower, a world of flashing red and blue lights, shouting voices, and the constant wail of sirens. Firefighters and paramedics
Swarmed the area, their faces smudged with soot and disbelief as they stared at the small group of survivors who had seemingly crawled from the earth itself. A paramedic rushed towards Elias, a triage tag in her hand. "Urgent. Sir, are you hurt? We need to get you checked out." Elias barely registered her presence. He looked past her, his eyes scanning the devastated skyline, his gaze fixed on the distant block where his apartment, where Maya was. The tower, the escape, the other survivors, they were already fading, becoming part of a story that was no longer his. His only story was at home. Shaky voice. "He's the one," a voice said. It was Chloe, stepping between Elias and the paramedic. She pointed a trembling finger back at the quiet janitor, emotional. "That man, He saved us. We all did, Henderson grunted, leaning heavily on the young security guard who was helping him limp. He just showed us how. The story began to spill out then, a jumbled, emotional torrent from a dozen different voices. They told of the locked doors, the poisoned air, the ignored warnings, and the quiet man who knew the building's secrets, not from a screen, but from its very bones. They spoke not of a lone hero, but of a team, of a shared struggle in the dark. Elias heard none of it. He took one last look at the group, at Chloe, already looking like a reporter gathering her story, at Henderson, injured but alive, at Sterling, a broken man being led away by a police officer. And then he turned and walked away. He didn't run. He moved with a relentless, focused purpose, a man on the most important mission of his life. He pushed through the crowds of onlookers and emergency personnel, a ghost moving through a world of chaos. The sounds of the city faded into a dull roar. The sights of destruction became a blur. His entire universe narrowed to a single point, the front door of his apartment building. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force greater than any tremor. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking, and finally threw the door open. The apartment was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of a nightlight. And there, on the sofa, curled up under a blanket and being watched over by their elderly neighbor, was Maya. Her eyes fluttered open. "Papa," she whispered, a voice thick with sleep. The word broke him. The tension, the fear, the iron control that had held him together for hours simply shattered. He stumbled across the room and fell to his knees beside the sofa,
wrapping his arms around his daughter. He buried his face in her hair, which smelled of clean shampoo and sleep. And for the first time since the world had torn itself apart, Elias let himself breathe. He held her, the simple, profound, living purpose of his entire struggle, safe in his arms. He was home. 2 weeks later, the Ethelred Tower was no longer a landmark, but a tombstone. Wrapped in yellow caution tape, its empty, darkened windows stared out over a city slowly stitching itself back together. The official story had shifted. It was no longer a tragic tale of an earthquake, but a national scandal of corporate negligence, thanks to a front-page article by a journalist named Chloe. Her piece, meticulously detailing a trail of financial corruption that led to a fatal over-reliance on automated systems, had given a voice to the whispers Elias had heard in the building's bones. The frantic energy in Elias's small apartment had subsided into a new, comfortable quiet. Maya's new nebulizer, paid for by a survivor's gratitude fund, hissed softly in the corner, a sound of quiet victory. There was a knock on the door. It was Henderson. He leaned heavily on a cane, his arm in a sling, but his eyes were clear and steady. The frantic, haunted look was gone, replaced by a calm, quiet purpose. He carried a large roll of drafting paper. "Elias," he said, nodding a greeting. He didn't offer an apology. Their shared experience in the darkness had moved them beyond that. He walked over to the kitchen table and unrolled the paper. It was a blueprint for a new, mid-sized office building. "Omnicorp is finished," Henderson said, his voice even. "Their assets are being liquidated, but other companies are already bidding on new projects. They're all terrified. They need to prove their new buildings are safe, not just on a screen, but in reality." He tapped the blueprint. "I'm starting a new safety consulting firm, a proper one." He looked up from the plans and met Elias's gaze. "I've already handled the incorporation, the insurance, all the paperwork, but I can't do it alone. I need a partner." He pushed a business card across the table. It read, "Foundation Safety Partners, Henderson and Velez." "You see the patterns people miss, Elias," Henderson said. "You see the shortcuts before they're even taken. I handle the paperwork. We can make sure this never happens again." It wasn't an offer of charity. It was a partnership, a foundation built not on concrete, but on a shared, harrowing truth. Later that evening, long after Henderson had left, Elias sat with Maya at the same table. She was drawing, her crayons spread out around her. She had filled the page not with the picture of a hero, but with a large, intricate maze of twisting, intersecting corridors. There were dozens of paths, dead ends and looping passages. She held it up for him to see, her small face serious.
Papa?
She asked, pointing a crayon at the complex design. Curiously,
Which way is out?
Elias looked at the drawing, at the endless possibilities and hidden routes she had created. He thought of the dark tunnels, the sealed doors, and the quiet knowledge that had guided them. A slow smile touched his lips. Reassuringly. "All of them," he said softly. "Gently. If you know where to look."
Thank you for taking a quiet moment with us. Every story is a journey, and we're so glad you joined us for this one.
We believe stories are a way to connect, even when we're apart. If you felt a connection to this tale, we invite you to subscribe and become part of our growing circle.
Our question for you today is, what's a simple moment of peace you've experienced this week?
Share it in the comments. Let's fill this space with serene moments.
Until the next story, be well.